Hello, my dear listener. I'm reaching out to you from the other side of the screen. I hope you enjoy my content. Please give a like or a dislike so I know if my work interests you. I would be very happy to have you subscribe to the channel. Let's go, buddy. I hadn't been back in this town for several years. It had always felt unbearably small to me, like a cage whose walls pressed in on my every move. But today, it seemed different. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. The gray, empty streets with their vacant windows, the peeling facades of the houses that stared like hollowed out eyes. It all looked more like a stage set than the place where I once lived. The path to the cemetery appeared suddenly, as if someone had deliberately hidden it behind a tangle of dry branches and leaves. Gravel crunched underfoot, the sound strangely grating on my ears. The air was damp and heavy, as though rain was imminent. A faint breeze stirred, but its touch was chilling. The cemetery was just as I remembered it. Narrow alleys paved with cracked tiles, old oaks standing in solemn rows, and a sea of headstones, each holding someone's story. I walked slowly, even though I knew exactly where I was going. My mind pulsed with the thought that I wasn't ready, that I needed more time to face what lay ahead. Her grave was exactly where I had left it a year ago. A smooth gray stone with sharp letters etched into it. Hannah Reeves, beloved daughter and sister. The inscription felt like mockery. Memories of the day we buried her surged to the surface. The damp earth, heavy raindrops, muted voices of those gathered. The pastor's words were a blur. I barely heard them, unable to tear my eyes from the coffin being lowered into the ground. Now there was silence, a silence so profound it rang in my ears. I sat on the edge of the stone border, burying my head in my hands. My mind betrayed me, conjuring fragments of her voice, her laughter, the way she looked at me that last time. I fought to suppress these images, but the harder I tried, the more they overwhelmed me. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the cemetery, where the dense thickets of trees began, stood a phone booth. It looked out of place, like a forgotten relic abandoned in the midst of this somber setting. Rusty and peeling, with shattered glass panels, it resembled a ghost of the past. What struck me the most was that I had never noticed it before. The booth seemed to draw my gaze. I tried to refocus on my purpose here, but the strange object at the edge of my vision refused to let go of my attention. It was as though an invisible finger had poked my side, urging me to turn back. Why hadn't I seen it before? The thought buzzed in my mind like an annoying mosquito. I rose slowly. The grave was just as I had left it, flowers already beginning to wilt, a small porcelain angel my father had once brought here. Everything looked peaceful, but inside me a storm was raging. Step by step, I walked toward the booth. Up close, it was even stranger. The door was slightly ajar, revealing an old telephone inside, just a regular phone, the kind you don't see anymore. The buttons were coated in a layer of dust, but appeared oddly intact. Inside, the air smelled of dampness, metal, and something else, something I couldn't place. I reached out to touch the phone but immediately recoiled. It was freezing, as though it had just been pulled from a freezer. My heart began to race for reasons I couldn't explain. Something about this place felt wrong. I examined the booth again. One of the glass panels was broken, letting in a weak beam of autumn sunlight. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dried leaves littered the floor. It was just an abandoned phone booth, yet it continued to fill me with an unshakable unease. Then I noticed the sticker. Small and faded, it was stuck to the inside of the door. It displayed a phone number, 7 digits written in neat black handwriting. For some reason, I memorized them immediately. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe the emptiness inside me. Maybe the desire to hear anything other than the silence that had surrounded me all year. Or maybe it was curiosity burning me from within. I dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. The sound stretched endlessly, as though someone was deliberately slowing time. The air inside the booth grew stifling, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. A click, silence, another click. I froze, unable to lower the receiver from my ear. My ears buzzed like the distant rumble of thunder. I was about to hang up when I heard it, breathing. Heavy, labored, like someone trying to speak but unable to find the words. It was faint, but grew louder with each passing second. I tightened my grip on the receiver, feeling a wave of cold sweep over me, and then I heard the voice. Everything inside me clenched. My legs buckled, my hands trembled. The voice was painfully familiar, one I could never mistake. I dropped the receiver, bolted out of the booth, and ran. Chapter 2: The Call of the Void. The house where I was staying felt as foreign as the rest of this town. The floorboards creaked under my steps, and the faded white walls seemed to whisper forgotten stories. The more I looked at these rooms, the stronger the feeling grew that I shouldn't be here. Then again, I felt that way everywhere I went. After the cemetery, I felt weakened somehow. Everything around me became muted, as if I were viewing the world through a dense veil. Sounds were muffled, colors were faded, and even my own breathing seemed alien. I tried to shake off this state, convincing myself it was just fatigue. But the image of that phone booth had lodged itself in my mind. I tried to distract myself. I unpacked my things, mechanically placing them on the shelves to fill the emptiness somehow. I opened the window, but a damp wind mixed with the smell of rain and fallen leaves immediately blew into the room. I closed it. Even the television didn't help. Its monotonous hum only intensified the oppressive feeling. But what haunted me most was what I'd heard. The voice. I couldn't admit it. Couldn't say a word aloud because each one would sound insane. And yet, I knew that voice. It was her voice, Hannah. All evening, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that it was just a trick of the mind, an old telephone, perhaps faulty wiring causing interference, or maybe it was a recording. I even tried to recall if I'd heard stories of such hoaxes, someone deliberately recording a voice and connecting it to a booth to play pranks. And yet, that voice, it didn't sound like a recording. It was live breathing, labored and weak, as if it came from far away, from the depths of something I couldn't comprehend. As night fell, my anxiety grew. The house sank into cold, sticky silence, broken only by the barely audible creaking of wood. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but sleep wouldn't come. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but my thoughts, like gusts of wind, kept returning me to the cemetery, to the booth, to the voice. Closer to midnight, I heard a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the old walls of the house settling, but soon realized the sound was coming from outside. It was a light, almost inaudible tapping, like someone gently drumming their fingertips against the window pane. My body froze. The sound continued, growing more distinct. I slowly rose from the bed, trying not to make a sound. I approached the window, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I looked outside. No one. Moonlight illuminated the yard in front of the house, highlighting the silhouettes of trees and shrubs. Everything was still, and yet the sound didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from inside my head, a vibration echoing in my temples. I abruptly closed the curtains, returned to the bed, and sat on the edge. Cold sweat trickled down my back, and my breathing became ragged. It was exhaustion, of course, exhaustion. Everything that had happened today had built up, turning into pressure that now manifested in these oddities. I repeated these words to myself like a mantra, but they brought no relief. I couldn't sleep. When morning came, I left the house with a clear purpose. I needed to return to the cemetery. Logic drowned in the chaos of my thoughts, but I knew one thing, that Booth wouldn't leave me alone. If I wanted to rid myself of this strange feeling, I needed to see it again. On the way, I hardly noticed the people around me. A hum filled my head, preventing me from focusing. The town seemed even emptier than yesterday, and the air was thick and heavy, as if before a storm. The same silence reigned at the cemetery, but now it felt more sinister. I passed by Hannah's grave without stopping. Without realizing it, I was already heading to where the phone booth had stood yesterday. It was still there. This time it looked even stranger. I couldn't explain it, but it seemed different. The metal appeared slightly shinier, as if someone had recently touched it. The faint smell of mold I'd barely noticed yesterday was now pronounced. I stepped inside again. My hand reached for the receiver on its own. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been yesterday. The receiver, the buttons, all looking as if no one had been here for years. But when I took the receiver in my hand, it felt warm. This fact made me recoil. I closed my eyes, trying to collect my thoughts. I should stop, just walk away and never return. But instead, I dialed the number again, 077. The ringing started almost immediately. This time it was quieter, but had a strange rhythm that triggered a migraine. I waited, though each second felt like an eternity. A click, silence, another click, and suddenly, a voice I was now afraid to acknowledge. After the second call, I don't remember how I left the cemetery. It was as if something had pushed me out, forcing me to leave the booth behind. My legs carried me along the paths between the gravestones as though trying to flee from what I had just heard. Yet in my mind, like a curse, her voice lingered. It was her voice. It was impossible. Back at the house, I felt the same strange cold, as if the entire space had been filled with emptiness. The walls pressed in, and the ceiling seemed to hang lower and lower. The room that had felt too spacious just yesterday now seemed to be closing in around me. I tried to calm myself, mechanically turning on the kettle and sitting at the table, staring at the blank white mug in front of me. My hands trembled. I couldn't decide what scared me more, the fact that I had heard her voice or the realization that I wanted to go back again. The tea cooled without ever receiving my attention. The clock on the wall struck noon, but time felt frozen. I tried to distract myself, opening my laptop, skimming the news, but the image stayed fixed in my mind. The booth, the telephone, the slowly dialed numbers, and the voice. It was painfully familiar. I had heard it 1,000 times before, knew its intonations, the slight trembling in its words, but it was different. It lacked warmth, energy. It felt as though I wasn't speaking to a living person, but to an echo of the past. Time crawled by, thick and slow like molasses. The sun outside dipped lower, painting the walls in crimson and gold hues, but I barely noticed. A battle raged within me. I wanted to forget, to push this out of my life, but something deep inside screamed that it was impossible. I had gone too far. By evening, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. The quiet whisper I felt within me grew louder. Not words, no, just a sensation, like someone was calling to me, like wind rustling through empty rooms or the faint creak of floorboards. This whisper gave me no peace, and I gave in. The night was cold, as if heralding the first snow. The moon, veiled by clouds, gave off only a dim light, making the town appear even gloomier. I walked quickly, not looking back, not glancing to the sides. The streets were empty. Somewhere in the distance, the silhouette of a cat darted across the road, only heightening my tension. The cemetery greeted me with the same oppressive silence. This time, the trees seemed taller, their branches tangled in the darkness, forming a black canopy overhead. The gravestones seemed to shift as I passed, though I knew it was an illusion. Still, I avoided looking at them. The booth was waiting for me. Now I understood it had always been there. Even when it wasn't, it had existed somewhere beyond perception, waiting for me to come. The metal glinted faintly in the moonlight, and the glass, cracked and webbed with spider-like fractures, seemed to watch me. Inside, everything was the same. Dampness, the smell of mold, the metal phone with its peeling paint. I picked up the receiver, my palm slick with sweat. The buttons, just like before, seemed to glow faintly with an inner light. 0, 7, 7, ringing. Once, twice, silence. Then, a click. I waited, holding my breath. Breathing was hard, as if the air had thickened into water. The receiver in my hand felt heavy, like a lump of lead. Then I heard it again, breathing. It was faint, barely audible, but undeniably real. This time it lasted longer. And then the voice, the same voice. It was weak, as if pushing through a dense veil. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the intention. It was calling me. My heart stopped as I suddenly realized she knew I was here. She could feel my presence. In that moment, the voice grew louder, the words clearer, but still incomprehensible. They sounded as though they were coming from the other side of a wall. I couldn't take it anymore. Dropping the receiver, I bolted from the booth without looking back. My ears rang, and strange phrases I had heard swirled in my mind. At that moment, I understood one thing. The line between me and the other world was no longer broken. It had been pulled tight, thin, and fragile, ready to snap at any moment. Returning home after my third visit to the booth felt like a trial of endurance. It was as if I was dragging an invisible weight behind me. The air had grown thick, like a dense fog, clinging to me with a sticky film of fear. My clothes reeked of the dampness of the cemetery, and I didn't bother taking them off, as though the remnants of the night's horror had seeped into my skin. I don't remember closing the door behind me or sitting down on the couch. It wasn't until later, when darkness had fully enveloped the room, that I realized I was sitting in complete silence, staring at a single point on the wall. Time had frozen. Minutes and hours melded into a monotonous, viscous haze of waiting. The voices. They wouldn't leave me now. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense, something audible to the ear. Instead, it was a presence, a rhythmic, insistent sensation emanating from within, as though words were stirring beneath my skin, deep within my consciousness. They weren't mine, they were foreign, fragmented, like echoes bouncing off countless walls. I tried to recall the fragments I had heard in the booth, but the more I strained my memory, the more indistinct they became. Certain words surfaced like debris from a sunken ship. Wait, threshold, come. Squeezing my temples, I shut my eyes, hoping to banish these thoughts. But every attempt to stem the tide of my mind only seemed to amplify the voice. Then I heard the creak. It was so real that I flinched. The sound was unmistakable, like wooden floorboards bowing under someone's weight. The thought shot through my mind. The house is empty. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Is someone here? Slowly, I stood up, careful not to make a sound. The room was nearly pitch black, save for a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The creak came again, closer this time. I took a step toward the door, moving as quietly as I could. My breathing turned shallow, and my heart pounded so loudly, I was certain the entire house could hear it. I reached the kitchen and froze, listening. Silence. For a moment, I convinced myself it was all in my head, a trick of my overtaxed nerves. But then, just as I took another step, I heard it, a faint sound directly behind me, breathing. It was sharp, irregular, like in the booth. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body froze, and my heart skipped a beat. Something warm brushed the back of my neck, not quite a touch, but enough to make my skin crawl. I knew there was nothing there, or perhaps I just didn't want to know. When I finally turned, the room was empty. Leaning against the wall, I felt my legs buckle beneath me. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. In its emptiness, there was something menacing, as though the absence of sound had solidified into a suffocating presence. I didn't sleep that night. When the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the window, I felt a small measure of relief. But with the dawn came a realization that filled me with dread. All the silence, the whispers, the voice. It hadn't ended at the booth. It had followed me. By noon, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. It felt as though the walls were watching me, the shadows on the floor shifting ever so slightly, though I knew that was impossible. My head rang like a bell, the noise pulling me deeper into chaos. And yet, I found myself walking back there. The booth had become a part of me now. It clung to me like a bone fused to flesh. I knew I had to return. It was calling me. This time, the cemetery greeted me with something different. The usual stillness was heavier, more oppressive, but I could feel movement within it. The distant trees seemed to stretch their gnarled branches toward me. The grass was damp and cold, its earthy scent filling my lungs and making me dizzy. I approached the booth and stopped short. It looked different this time. The metal seemed cleaner, gleaming as though someone had polished it recently. But the most striking thing was the glass. It was flawless, perfectly intact, even though I distinctly remembered one of the panels being shattered the day before. I opened the door. The floor was spotless, no dust, no leaves. Everything looked as though someone had meticulously cared for it. My body moved on its own. I picked up the receiver and dialed the number 077. The ringing was the same as before, but now it had a different rhythm. It didn't feel like it was coming through a phone line, but directly from my mind. A click. Then once again, the voice. This time, I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't just a voice. It was a torrent of words, incomprehensible, yet alluring. I felt their rhythm pull me in, the words merging into a flowing stream of sound, dragging me deeper. And then I understood. The booth wasn't just a device anymore, it was alive. I returned home as if in a dream. The journey back blurred together, like walking through a dense fog where there was neither beginning nor end. The city's streets seemed less real, as though I were seeing them through frosted glass. Even the buildings appeared to shift aside, clearing a path for me. The voice still echoed in my mind. Its words were no longer fragmented whispers. They were beginning to take shape, like a photograph slowly developing. Snatches of phrases I couldn't fully grasp sank deeper into my thoughts. You must come. They're waiting. Jake, I'm here. My name. It said my name. I nearly stopped in my tracks as the realization hit me. This couldn't be a coincidence or some trick of the mind. The booth knew who I was. The voice knew who I was. When I closed the door behind me at home, the silence fell over me again, suffocating like a heavy wave. But this was a different kind of silence, not merely the absence of sound. It moved, it breathed. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, but the screen only showed static, white noise that grated on my ears. I switched it off, sat on the bed, and forced myself to focus on something mundane, something grounded. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the booth. It was pulling me in, and the harder I resisted, the stronger the pull became. The rustling began closer to nightfall. At first, I thought it was the wind. The window trembled under its faint pressure, and outside, the trees bent as if trying to peer inside. But when I got up to close the curtains, I noticed the leaves were perfectly still. Everything outside was motionless. The rustling continued. It was coming from inside the house. I didn't dare follow the sound. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring into the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. It was too quiet. This silence felt like the one surrounding the booth, but now it had a life of its own, taking on form and substance. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood, moving slowly toward the hallway, careful not to make a sound. My breathing was shallow, and my heart pounded in my chest like a hammer. My footsteps echoed dully in my ears. The kitchen was empty, but the sense of a presence was so strong, I nearly screamed. Everything around me felt wrong. The air was dense, as though there wasn't enough oxygen in the room. On the table lay my phone. I was certain I had left it in another room. The screen flickered, once, then again. It wasn't a call or a notification, just a faint pulse of light coming from within. I froze, watching the flickering glow grow brighter. Then came the sound. The phone began to ring, but it wasn't my ringtone. The sound resembled the old bell of a rotary phone, just like the one in the booth. It echoed harshly, jarringly, as if coming from another world. I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and answered. There was silence on the other end, but it wasn't empty. In that silence, I heard breathing, labored, heavy, as though someone was trying to speak but couldn't. My throat went dry, and my body froze, paralyzed. And then I heard the voice again. It was her, Hannah. Her words were clearer now, distinct, yet each one seemed to slice through my mind like a blade. She was calling me, begging. Her voice trembled, almost breaking into a sob. She said she was trapped somewhere, that she needed me to come. Come, you must. They won't let me go without you. I dropped the phone and stumbled back. The room spun, and I collapsed to the floor. My breathing was ragged, and my fingers clawed at the carpet as though it could anchor me against the storm raging inside. The phone flickered again. Its screen lit up, displaying a single word: Booth. I let the phone fall, but the screen remained lit. The word pulsed like a heartbeat, casting a faint light. It grew brighter and brighter until finally the screen went dark. I knew then that I had no choice. The cemetery greeted me like an old acquaintance. This time, I didn't feel fear, only a strange sense of relief. Everything beyond this place no longer mattered. My life, my memories, even the fear of death, all of it dissolved the moment I saw the booth. It was waiting for me. The booth was different now. It glowed from within, casting a dim, ominous light like the one I'd seen on my phone's screen. Its edges were blurred, as if it didn't quite belong to this world, but was merely brushing against it. I stepped inside. The receiver hung on its hook, and I picked it up as if in a trance. This time, there was no need to dial. The number was already there. I heard the ringing as soon as the receiver touched my ear. 1, 2, 3, a click. The voice came immediately. You've come. The door is open now. And then I understood. The calls weren't to the dead. They were for me. The booth stood still around me, yet it felt alive, something greater than metal and glass. Inside, the air thickened, taking on weight and texture, pressing against me like a suffocating presence. The light streaming through the glass was strange, fractured, as though filtered through water. Everything around me trembled, like the distorted landscape of a dream where reality's rules no longer apply. The voice in the receiver was broken, fragmented, but its words were unmistakably clear. They resonated deep within me, making my heart pound so loudly I could barely think. You've come. The door's open now. What door? My thoughts scrambled for answers, but every attempt at logic only plunged me deeper into confusion. The voice didn't repeat itself, but its presence lingered, a sound no longer heard, yet somehow still felt. Slowly, I lowered the receiver. The moment I did, something strange began to happen inside the booth. The solid walls vibrated, the glass fogged from within, faint traces appearing as if someone were trying to write from the other side. My sweat-slick hand slipped from the receiver, and it fell with a hollow clatter. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same empty silence I'd encountered before. This silence was alive, teeming with sounds I couldn't hear but felt with every nerve in my body. I couldn't resist. I glanced outside. The cemetery had changed. Fog, which hadn't been there before, coiled between the gravestones, twisting into strange, spiraling shapes. The trees lining the pathways seemed taller, their gnarled branches reaching toward the ground as if clawing for something unseen. The moonlight, filtered through the thickening clouds, was dim and lifeless, like the dying glow of a distant fire. But the strangest thing of all was the figures. At first, I thought they were just tricks of the shadows, but their movements were too fluid, too deliberate. One stood atop a hill, its silhouette vaguely human, barely visible through the swirling mist. It was staring directly at me, and the coldness of that gaze froze me where I stood. My legs trembled, threatening to give way, but I couldn't look away. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and awkward, as though it wasn't used to walking. Then I noticed there were more of them. They emerged from the fog, rising like shadows, given life under the fading light of the moon. My heart pounded furiously, but I was paralyzed. The booth behind me no longer felt like a refuge. It had become a gateway, an opening that had unleashed this. And then it hit me. I had released them. Every call I made, every attempt to connect with the voice, had opened a line, a bridge between two worlds. I could feel that bridge now, trembling as if on the verge of collapse under the weight of what was crossing it. One of the figures moved closer than the rest. It seemed to dissolve into the fog, its shape indistinct but recognizable. A head, shoulders, arms that were unnaturally long. It stood just a few paces away, and the air between us turned icy. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. It simply stared, but its gaze was inhuman. It was the kind of look that stripped away your defenses, leaving you bare and vulnerable. I knew that if I stepped closer or tried to speak, I would lose something. Perhaps myself. The other figures began to move, encircling me in a slow, deliberate motion. The fog thickened, blurring the boundaries between the cemetery and whatever lay beyond. I could no longer tell where the graveyard ended and something else began. And then I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it didn't come from the booth. It came from everywhere, from the fog, the wind, the figures themselves, as though they were all part of the same entity. The doors open. Now you see. The words pierced my mind like needles. They weren't just words. They were a command, a call to action that I couldn't fully comprehend but knew I couldn't disobey. I stepped back instinctively, only to feel the cold metal of the booth press against my spine. Its walls, once a barrier, now felt like ice. The figures moved closer, tightening their circle, and then I saw her. The figure standing furthest from the rest was different. Its outline was sharper, more distinct, and the moonlight illuminated it in a way that made recognition immediate. It was Hannah. Her eyes, empty yet alive, locked onto mine. She didn't speak, but I understood what she wanted me to do. I had to go back into the booth. It was the only place where I still felt like myself, the only place where I could think. Everything outside had become foreign, but the booth, despite its strangeness, was now the center of this nightmare. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I picked up the receiver, my movements mechanical, as if guided by an unseen force. This time, there was no need to dial. The line was already connected. The ringing began the moment I held the receiver to my ear. 1, 2, 3. A click. And then the voice returned. "You've opened the door. Now you must enter." I sat in the booth, feeling the world outside slowly dissolve. The metallic walls were no longer a barrier between me and what awaited beyond. They breathed, shimmered, and trembled like fabric stretched too tightly over a frame. The fog, which had coiled around the booth, now seeped inside, spiraling in thin tendrils, as if searching for a way to push me out. The receiver in my hand was no longer just an object. It vibrated and pulsed, conveying something incomprehensible. There were no more dial tones, yet the receiver seemed alive, like an organic entity foreign to anything I had ever known. "You've opened the door. Now you must enter." The words echoed in my head again, but they no longer resembled Hannah's voice. Instead, they were a collective chorus, rising from the depths of graves, resonating through the ground, air, and time itself. My hands trembled. I tried to let go of the receiver, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It felt fused to my palm, as though invisible threads were binding me to it. The booth shuddered. Everything inside grew dark. I heard the sound of glass cracking behind me and turned, expecting to see something lurking in the fog. But there was nothing, only an absolute blackness. It felt as if the entire world beyond the booth had vanished, leaving me alone with this spatial cage. And then I saw them. Silhouettes began to appear on the glass, hands, palms, splayed fingers, as if shadows were trying to break through. They slid across the surface, leaving faint traces like scratches. The movements grew faster, and more of them came. I tried closing my eyes, but it didn't help. Those hands, those shapes seeped into my mind. They weren't pleading, they were demanding. Come. The booth was no longer a refuge. It had become a capsule, pulling me deeper into its own reality. Inside me, a strange sound echoed, like the splintering of glass breaking from within. And then the receiver came to life again. It rang, but the sound was nothing like before. It was a piercing screech, like grinding metal, cutting through to my very bones. I didn't want to answer it. I resisted, but my hands moved on their own. When the receiver touched my ear, there were no dial tones. Instead, a chaotic flood of noises poured in. Whispers, screams, laughter, and sobs, all tangled into a dissonant cacophony. Then came the voice again, cold, calm, and unyielding. You are ready. Go. Before my eyes, a vision unfolded that wasn't part of the booth. I saw a cemetery, but not the one I had just left. This place was different. It stretched endlessly, an ocean of gravestones glowing with a faint blue light. The air was thick and pulsing with a sound like a heartbeat. In the distance, where the horizon dissolved into darkness, I saw figures. They stood motionless, their silhouettes blurry, as though their forms wavered between existence and nothingness. And yet, I recognized one of them, Hannah. Her face, now cold and distant, looked straight at me. She stood on the edge of a massive chasm that split the ground as if some giant hand had torn it apart. The blue glow from the gravestones poured into the fissure, vanishing into its depths. And then I felt the booth begin to move. It was no longer stationary. Its walls vibrated. The light inside flickered, growing alternately brighter and dimmer. The floor beneath me seemed to vanish, and I was overcome by the sensation of falling. But this wasn't a normal fall. It carried me deeper into a space I couldn't comprehend. I knew I was no longer in the cemetery. At some point, everything stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself at the center of the very graveyard I had seen. The voice was no longer in the receiver. It was everywhere, filling the air, the earth, and everything around me. You made your choice. Now you are one of us. The ground beneath me began to tremble. The figures in the distance started moving toward me, their motions fluid and continuous, like water. Hannah led the way, her face devoid of pain or sadness. It was empty. They surrounded me, but they didn't attack. They simply stood there, watching. I felt my body grow lighter, as if it were losing its physical weight. My consciousness began to scatter, like smoke dissolving into the air, becoming part of something far greater. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. I had become one of them. I opened my eyes, but there was no light. Darkness surrounded me, not the familiar emptiness of a closed room or a deep cave, but a tangible, oppressive blackness. It enveloped me like a heavy, suffocating blanket devoid of warmth. I couldn't see my hands or feet, but somehow I was aware of my body. I felt as though I was standing on something, yet the ground beneath me was insubstantial, like balancing on the edge of existence between the material and the immaterial. The silence was not truly silent. It buzzed, vibrating with the faint hum of countless voices speaking at once, so softly that their words blurred into a monotone drone. I tried to breathe, but couldn't find air. Every second that passed made it clearer. I was no longer in the world I knew. Shapes began emerging from the darkness. They moved slowly, but their presence was immediate, as if they had always been there. They didn't resemble people. Their forms shifted fluidly, constantly transitioning from one shape to another. My gaze caught fleeting impressions of faces, but they dissolved almost instantly into something else, fragments of memories or alien visions. And then I saw her again, Hannah. Her form was more stable than the others, though still unnervingly fluid. Her face no longer seemed familiar. It was a reflection of something foreign, something using her appearance to make me acknowledge it. She stared at me, and a strange shiver coursed through me, a mixture of fear and an inexplicable pull. She took a step forward. Her movements were smooth, yet every step reverberated in my mind like a hammer blow. I wanted to back away, but my legs felt rooted in place. The darkness around me rippled, like water disturbed by a falling stone. As she drew closer, her voice came, not just from her lips, but from inside my head, echoing from every direction, layered with countless other tones. "You found me, Jake, but now you see I can't leave." Her words shattered the silence, but they weren't her own. I knew that. It wasn't her voice. It was alien, cold, empty, filled with an endless echo. It flooded my mind, threatening to wash away everything that made me who I was. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Hannah continued to move closer until her face was inches from mine. Her eyes, once warm and alive, were now black voids where a dim bluish light flickered faintly. "You opened the door, and now you are part of it." I wanted to understand what she meant, but instead I began to see everything. The world around me unfurled, like a scroll rolling open. I realized the darkness was just a shell. Beneath it lay endless fields of graves, winding rivers of light streaming through the ground. These were souls, countless souls, pulsing to the rhythm of some unfathomable law. They flowed, merged, and tore apart, their cries reverberating across the expanse. This place wasn't merely a realm of the dead. It wasn't hell, heaven, or anything described in stories. It was a transition, a threshold I had crossed when I answered the call. And I wasn't alone. I saw them, beings whose forms defied description. They watched me from afar, as if waiting for me to make the next move. They were vast and minuscule at once, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glimmering with an eerie, incomprehensible light. One of them began to approach. I felt its presence before I saw it. It moved through the river of light, and the darkness thickened around it. It had no fixed shape, but every moment it became what I feared most. "You've crossed over," it thundered in my mind. "Now you are one of us." But I didn't want to be one of them. I began to back away, though my legs felt heavy and uncooperative. The darkness grew denser, and the figures surrounded me. Hannah, or what had been her, stood still, but her empty, soulless gaze never left me. In my mind, one thought repeated itself. I have to find a way out. I tried to focus. This world was foreign. Its laws were unknown to me. But I knew one thing. The door had been opened. That meant it could be closed. But someone had to stay behind to close it. With that realization, I felt the space around me begin to crack. The sound of tearing came from all directions, as though the fabric of this reality was straining under my presence. The voice echoed again, loud and menacing. "You will not leave. You belong to us." But I resisted. I couldn't leave the door open. Everything I had unleashed had to remain here. I closed my eyes, concentrating on what lay beyond this place, on reality, on the sounds and smells of the world I had left behind. I knew that if I stayed here, I would become part of this world. But if I could close the door, I opened my eyes. The booth was around me again. The figures were gone, but the darkness still writhed, alive and threatening. The receiver in my hand pulsed violently. I felt my legs regain their strength. This was my choice. I would either stay here or find a way to close the door and return to reality. The booth trembled around me, its walls vibrating as though the entire space resisted my presence. Outside, the darkness continued to churn and swell, like an ocean ready to consume me. Inside, I could feel the otherworldly realm pulling at me, as if I had already become a part of it, its possession. The receiver in my hand was no longer cold. It pulsed, becoming an extension of my own body, a living organ feeding on my fear and indecision. The voices outside the booth grew louder. They didn't scream or whisper. They simply were, a resonant wave without beginning or end, erasing every memory of the life I once had. Hannah was still there, standing far beyond the glass walls. Her form flickered, her face radiating something strange, not pain, not anger, but an all-consuming emptiness. In that moment, I understood. She could never return. Her voice, her call, they were part of this world, part of the darkness I had unwittingly unleashed. But I was still alive. I could still make a choice. A sudden jolt shook the booth, causing it to sway. I felt its walls weaken, as if they might collapse and dissolve into this alien realm. I gripped the receiver tightly, realizing it was my only anchor, the sole link connecting me to the world I had left behind. That's when I saw it. On the wall of the booth, where once there had been only peeling paint, a message had appeared. Deep, jagged lines etched into the surface spelled out, "Close the door if you want to save yourself." Everything inside me froze. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel the blood surging in my temples. This wasn't advice, it was a command, and with it came the understanding. The door I had opened couldn't be closed from the outside. I had to stay. I knew this. Every fiber of my being rebelled against it. Every nerve screamed that I had to find another way, that I couldn't just vanish. But deep inside, in the furthest corners of my consciousness, a quiet voice whispered louder with each passing second. "This is your sacrifice. You've known it all along." I looked at Hannah again. She didn't move, but her gaze said more than words ever could. She couldn't ask me to stay, but I knew she understood. I was her last chance, the final link tethering her to the home she would never see again. I took a step back, the floor of the booth creaking under my weight. The receiver in my hand vibrated again, and I heard a voice, not Hannah's, not the otherworldly entity's. It was my own. "You know what to do." I closed my eyes and released the receiver. At that moment, the booth began to contract around me. The darkness outside surged forward, like a tidal wave consuming everything in its path. I felt the cold seep into every cell of my body, the air around me thickening as though I were breathing underwater. Yet alongside the fear came an overwhelming sense of calm. I knew I was making the right choice. The world began to unravel. The darkness, bookie once alive, now started to recede, collapsing in on itself like water draining into a vortex. The voices outside the booth grew fainter until they disappeared entirely. I could feel the boundaries of this world closing in, the space sealing shut as though the door I had opened was slowly being locked. And then there was silence, a profound, absolute silence, the kind I hadn't experienced since this began. It was deep, full, and not at all frightening. I no longer felt my body. I was part of the silence, a fragment of its resonant stillness. In the final moments before everything faded, I thought of home, of the first time I saw the booth, of the moment I heard Hannah's voice, and of how I had become part of what I had unleashed. But the door was closed forever. On the old cemetery's edge, no one ventured anymore. The booth that once stood there had vanished, leaving behind only a patch of scorched earth, a scar on the land. People said the place had become unnervingly quiet, but sometimes, on windy nights, someone swears they've heard a phone ringing,